Thank you. It's great to get to collaborate with you. I appreciate you asking me to teach a class. And this particular class has been near and dear to my heart during the last couple of years of pandemic changes and event statuses. So thank you. I am Gera Gangolffin. I currently officially have the Office of Kingdom Seneschal, Education Deputy. I have recently taken the Kingdom Events Deputy hat back because that particular person needed to make a change and resign from her office. And that was my previous office. I was Kingdom Events Deputy for 3 years. I've also served in a number of branch roles, social media officer, Webster, Seneschal. I think I'm contingency Seneschal for life, potentially. I'm a frequent flyer event steward. Actually, that is my favorite thing to do in the SCA, running events. I love forming teams. I love putting the magic together. I love being on site and seeing the joy that people take in being there and sort of trying to recreate a little piece of the dream. Taught a lot of classes. I've been in the SCA for 9 years. I have been doing project, program, and technical management for 20 years. In fact, I've been at the same company now for 24 years. So that's kind of cool. And I just need to add the disclaimer that even though I'm teaching a class on general contract stuff, I'm not a lawyer. I have had lawyers review this class, but I am personally not a lawyer. So yeah, that's me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm looking, oh, by the way, my latest project, just because I am putting together a group to facilitate a live stream of 12th night. For those that are not able to attend 12th night, so all the 12th night courts will be live streamed. So that's my latest interesting project. That's who I am. That's the perspective I bring to this class. A lot of my experience related to this is outside the SCA, but it all came together really nicely in the Kingdom Events office. So let's talk about the scope of this class. I want, after we get through this class, for you all to, by the way, I'm a really informal instructor. Please raise your hand. Please drop in with chat, whatever makes sense to you. I definitely want to have a conversation with you all and not just talk at you about this subject matter. I know it's a bit dry and nerdy, but I think it's really important in terms of, number one, managing the risk to the SCA with the contracts we execute with the various site venues that we talk to. I also want to talk a little bit about Kingdom and Society requirements for contract approvals. There are some interesting gotchas there. We'll talk specifically about how contracts are constructed and what you want to review. We'll talk about negotiating because quite often, yes, you can negotiate. And we'll also talk about the idea that we maybe have some ways to protect the SCA if you don't actually have a contract with the vendor, but are continuing to work with them, because that's not uncommon, especially with small business or small farm type enterprises. Basic business law stuff. A contract is an expressed agreement between two parties to provide a product or service. Generally, it is in exchange for some consideration for such product or service, like $1 for, selling your daughter a car, whatever. That's a contract. Very specifically, in regards to the SCA, we run into verbal agreements, we run into paper agreements, we run into informal written agreements, we run into all sorts of agreements that are really super problematic. But a contract is at the very bottom of it all, that agreement between two parties that defines the product being provided and the consideration being given in return. It's really important to have a contract with our vendors for sites, for practice sites, for anything that we really need to clarify what is happening that manages the risk to the SCA. If we have an agreement with no cancellation policy, or we don't have an agreement with the site and they suddenly decide that they want to give it to somebody else that weekend, we have no recourse. If we have a cancellation policy, if we have some clear expectations about how that vendor is working with us, we have the ability to potentially avert any issues like that. It also gives us the ability to set clear expectations. Like, for example, the 1 year where I ran a Kingdom event thinking I had the fairground to myself, and suddenly there was a quinceanera right next to my event, which was okay at the end of the day. It was fine. We were a little worried about loud music, but it wasn't bad at all. But nonetheless, Ursulmus every year has race cars right next to the event, which does not a lot for the ambiance. but basically just setting out those clear expectations of what we want with the contract. Very specifically, again, I mentioned this a little bit ago, we're going to work with some vendors that don't have written contracts, whether it's the school you practice at or a local farm that lets you camp in their pasture for a weekend event, whatever. The emprise of the Black Lion is Madrona. I'm from Madrona. It's a Madrona event that's equestrian focused that we have every year, when it's not COVID. And the farm we have that at, the gal has just not ever been interested in having a contract. I have sent her a contract template and she doesn't even read it. I would actually encourage you, whenever possible, when you don't have a contract with the site, to bring them. Like I mentioned on this slide, we have a template contract out on the Kingdom Events website for US agreements that we can potentially customize and set up and provide a vendor so we have some sort of written agreement with them. If the vendor is not willing or interested in signing a contract, I very much recommend you make sure that you document all verbal agreements in an email or even a written letter to that vendor. So for example, when I get off the phone with my lovely emprise lady, who, by the way, not only not having contracts, she still manages all of her bookings in a shoebox with index cards behind her desk. So she's she's very old school. So when I get on the phone with her and I'm like, we want to reserve X date, this is how much you've agreed we're going to cost, this is how we're going to handle cabin rental, and we have come to verbal agreement on all that. The minute I hang up the phone, I sit down and I write that up into an email and I send it off to her. Or if she wasn't reading email, I do it in a snail mail letter. To say, hey, just want to make sure we're on the same page. It doesn't have to be the stilted formal per our phone call. It can be, want to make sure we're on the same page and I'm understanding you clearly. This is what I understand we're going forward with. She may not ever answer that, but the fact that you have an email summary of that verbal agreement reached in that phone call will be useful to you should you ever need to refer to that in the future. And we already have a chat question. Oh, Meryl, you have questions? Questions are awesome. And you know what's even more awesome? Cautionary tales. So this is a great class for cautionary tales. All right, on to the next section. Let's talk a little about who can sign a contract. One not broadly known area of knowledge around kingdom events specifically, not branch events, is that the Kingdom Seneschal must sign contracts related to a kingdom event, specifically site contracts. And we have had it so that because it used to be that wasn't the case, that the local Seneschal could sign the site contract for the kingdom event. But there's actually very specific policy. It's that second big bullet point. No Seneschal can commit a higher level of the SCA to any action. They can only speak for their level of the SCA. So local Seneschal can't commit the kingdom to an action by signing a kingdom level contract. Within the branch, your branch events, your sites for practice, any other contracts you execute, absolutely, your branch seneschal is the person who should be reviewing and signing those contracts. They may at times have a specifically authorized delegate. I will tell you from a liability perspective, it should be a warranted delegate. So if you have a contingency seneschal who's going to cover while your seneschal's in Hawaii for a month or something, that person should actually have a signed warrant. Just, CYA. Event stewards are warranted deputies to the seneschal, or deputies to the seneschal. They're not necessarily warranted, but the current policy is that the event stewards are not delegated to sign contracts. The seneschal must sign the contracts. Also, the person who's signing the contract must be a paid member of the SCA. A seneschal must be a paid member of the SCA. Hopefully those two are in alignment, but that's not always the case. Interesting, what if? We had a very enthusiastic event steward go out looking for a site, found a site he liked for his event, and he put $200 down on the site as a deposit out of his own money to secure, to reserve the site. Not cool. because by putting money down and reaching a verbal agreement, he was making an agreement on behalf of the branch that he was not warranted to make. So in scenarios like that, you really do want to have that agreement be made by the seneschal and the money come from the branch, not from the private pocket of somebody. Should be a check or however it's handled from the branch, as opposed to sort of commingling that stuff from a private user perspective. The Society Seneschal's Handbook has a lot of information about contracts in the SCA. So that's kind of the source for this piece of policy. But bottom line, seneschals must sign. Kingdom seneschals must sign for kingdom events. So that's kind of the bottom line. And this class is really intended to help site event stewards and seneschals understand the nature of site contracts and to negotiate them effectively. So we talked a little bit about written or verbal contracts. Obviously written is our best practice, but it happens that we have verbal contracts all the time. There are also unilateral or bilateral contracts. Example of a unilateral contract, which you don't really see very often in the SCA, would be like, for instance, a click through. Your Zoom. You click to accept the terms and conditions. Yes, you're buying a service from them, but there's no negotiation. There's no mutually commensurate. Meryl, no, you're correct. You are not signing on behalf of the SCA. You are signing on behalf of the site, correct? I'm sorry, Meryl asked a question. She doesn't need to be a seneschal in order to sign a site contract as the site owner. No, you don't. You're signing as the person who owns the site. I will say, though, that as the site owner, you cannot run the event. That's a conflict of interest. You have to have an event steward who runs the event with you as the owner of the site. So hopefully that's helpful. We see multiple types of contracts in the SCA. Obviously site contracts, and that's what this class is really focused on. Occasionally we'll see services contracts, like for PO boxes or porta potty service or whatever. But generally, most folks I've worked with, you just call and you sign up for it and they send you an invoice and you pay the invoice, and there's not really any contract beyond just the verbal agreement to secure the service. We're moving also toward potentially putting together a little bit more detailed purchase contracts for one-time purchase of things like pavilions, like regalia, thrones, etc., that sort of describe specifically what's being purchased and what's being paid for it and the kind of time frame that those folks are expecting. And the reason for that is it helps us sail through an audit from corporate with flying colors. We have that documentation in place. It also sets good expectations. I don't know if, I think everybody's been in scenarios where you buy something that's custom and you have some expectation about time frame and what you're buying, and suddenly it's a year later and you still haven't got the thing. So contracts can help with that as well. General questions related to a contract. When you're reading, everybody on this call needs to read their contracts. I mean, not instantly, but when you go look at a site, etc., I'm going to kind of talk about the general things you're looking for in a contract. Specifically, does the contract clearly specify the products and services covered? That sounds basic, but it's not. I have seen all sorts of times where I get, like, specifically hotel contracts, that the way they express what's actually being provided and the pricing structure, honestly, in a way that almost obscures understanding, because they want to make sure that they're able to get as much as they can out of the contract. So, the goal is to specify clearly exactly what you're paying for in all areas of the contract. Another thing that I've noticed, especially with the pandemic and moving events forward from year to year, I may have a contract for 2019 that prices one way, a contract for 2020 that prices the second way, and for 2021 that prices the third way. And I can't line them up and check that they're matching because they've mixed and matched things. So it's absolutely acceptable and a good thing to ask your vendors to lay out the pricing in the contract clearly and in a way that you can trace from year to year, from transaction to transaction. You're going to have different types of contracts for different sites, and I've kind of broke this down this way. It used to be I just had kind of one set of general recommendations, but honestly, you're going to have different contracts for an outdoor venue, for an indoor venue that's not a hotel or overnight site, and then for a hotel. I will say that we pay the most attention to the hotel contracts because those incur the greatest financial risk for the SCA. Again, we're going to make sure that we have specific contract obligations filled out. We want to make sure there's an impossibility clause in the contract. Every single contract that we have had in place in Ontario for the last 2 years, year and a half, the impossibility clauses and the cancellation policies have gotten a heck of a workout. So I want to make sure that everybody has a really solid understanding of what those are and why those are so critical to have in any contract you sign with the vendor. If the site owner verbally amends contract details, get it in writing. That's critical for any contract. So if the contract says this is a Boy Scout site and you can't have alcohol on site, and the site owner says, oh, but you guys are fine, in your private encampments, and you need to get it in writing from them, or at the very least, again, you send it to them in writing after the conclusion of your conversation with them. Just say, just to reflect what I heard from you, I understand that we are going to be able to have alcohol in private encampments during this weekend event. So that helps to sort of cover you. The final thing I think to look at in a site contract, and these are big gotchas, is are there any staffing coverage requirements? Do you need to have a handyman or a cleaning service on site? Are there mandatory third-party services? Do you have to bring in somebody for audiovisual equipment? Do you have to bring in somebody for AV setup, etc.? You also want to check, and I'll talk more about this later on, permits, whether or not the contract requires any specific permits, deposits, etc. And really not relevant what we're talking about, but occasionally you'll see time and materials contracts more on the side of regalia or thrones or whatever, where they're just sort of, you're paying by the hour and for the materials. Keon. He asked if we fill out a contract on a local level, do we need to send the contract to your principality, Seneschal, for review before or after signing? If it is binding your branch, you don't have to. You certainly can. I would say your principality and kingdom seneschals are a phenomenal resource for helping you review your contracts and determine if there are any gotchas. But as a branch, if you're binding your branch, you don't necessarily have to send it to them. That said, it could very well be that Seamus may be all, hey, I want to see all contracts for a while to get used to contracts, please send them to me. And that's a perfectly legit request. But generally speaking, you have the authority to sign branch contracts without review as a seneschal. We also have sometimes seen people sign things and then after they're signed, they just send them to principality or to kingdom just as an FYI. But honestly, the kingdom's not going to retain, or the principality is not going to retain copies of your contracts or anything like that. So bring them in if you need assistance, but it's not necessary that they review them. So let's talk about impossibility clauses. There's about 3 names that these are called. It is a clause in a contract that's all about unanticipated circumstances beyond control that might invalidate a contract. Generally, it starts with acts of God. So these can be called an acts of God clause, or it can be called the French force majeure, and I don't speak French, so that's probably horribly mispronounced, or impossibility clause. I think things are trending lately to calling it an impossibility clause. So things like a pandemic and regulations shutting down our ability to hold events in person would be potentially something that would trigger this impossibility clause that makes it illegal or impossible for the hotel to hold the event, or the fairground to hold the event, or whatever. This example is actually from the CTEC DoubleTree contract for 12th night this year. Your impossibility clause should be bilateral. Almost every time I see them, it starts out with the hotel shall not be responsible for failure to perform, and the hotel can terminate this agreement without liability. So one of the first things I ask for is for them to make that bilateral so that the SCA can also terminate the agreement in the case of an impossibility clause. The other thing that I recommend is that there be a date limitation in this, a date stamp at which this can be executed, as opposed to just this general thing that there is an impossibility clause, but there's no sort of date deadline for it. So make it bilateral ensure you have a date parameter giving you the ability to execute on this. I will say one interesting permutation after all of the, I'm sure you all have canceled a ton of contracts down there as well. After all of the cancels and reschedules and all of that, the really important thing here is the impossibility clause, the piece that makes it illegal or impossible for the venue to hold the event, is the policy or regulation that is at play in the location of the event from a legal restrictions perspective. So that's been really challenging for Ontario with the border crossing, because there are events we could potentially have had in Ontario because we've had some, ability to operate at 50 and 75% capacity and with masks and everything, but we can't get our royals across the border, and so we can't have the event. That actually the local party, the local venue can say, hey, I can hold an event. I don't know what your problem is. I'm ready to hold an event and I can do it within the parameters of current public health policy. And so in that case, the impossibility clause does not apply. That's what happened to Collegium, just so we know. Collegium is an event that's in Everett, was scheduled for Everett this fall. Because we were not able to get royals or a significant degree of ANS leadership across the border, we chose to cancel. But because Washington can hold events right now, impossibility clause did not apply, and we actually had to pay a small contract penalty to roll the contract forward to next year. Cancellation terms. Boy, these have gotten important. The cancellation terms, every contract needs to have a cancellation term. There are lots of them out there who don't. It's kind of scary. It should spell out the responsibilities related to cancellation, the date deadlines for cancellation, and any penalties and what the penalty schedule is for cancellation. One really annoying thing about site contracts is that if I cancel with the site, there's a penalty. There's generally a stiff penalty if we start getting close to the event. If the site cancels with us, most contracts don't have any teeth in it for that side of the cancellation. We actually had a couple of years ago, a July coronation site decide that they were going to start the renovations early and they just couldn't host our group after all. That was like disastrously painful and really absolutely a crazy time for that particular event steward. There was no penalty, and because that's a site that Thierry uses all the time, we didn't want to sort of be horrible about it, but it cost us money and it cost us a lot of time, and there was no penalty to the vendor. So just be aware that these terms are generally pretty much skewed in favor of the vendor. And honestly, they are designed to minimize the financial losses and risk for the vendor more than it is for us as the renter of the site. The venue generally will try to recover any financial investment to date, like if they've done infrastructure work, if they've blocked rooms, if they've turned down other bookings. But also they may try to recover any revenue risk related to an event, and that's something we'll get back around to later. I want to point out, this is one of the first places where we, well, actually, the impossibility clause and this are places that we as stewards of the SCA's resources can negotiate. In particular, I have an example further down on cancellation. I don't like the sequence that I moved this into. I'm going to jump to that example. Let's see. All right. This is a hotel event. This is the CTAC contract. This was the original cancellation schedule that they gave us. And this is kind of small print, so my apologies. Any minute after you sign the contract and cancel, there is a 10% revenue, anticipated revenue cancellation damage. They were counting this against a basis of both the venue rental and the room rental. I don't ever want to guarantee pieces of the room rental in contract if we don't absolutely have to. That said, hotels will ask you to do so, but we want to minimize that impact. So this event was for January of 2021. So this is for last year. So anything between March and June, they wanted 20%, anything between June and September, 40%, and after September, 60%. 60% of venue rental plus rooms is $38,000. $38,000 is about a third of Vontier's annual operating budget. That's a lot of money. We as a nonprofit cannot have that kind of financial exposure. So let's look at what we can do to negotiate it. Again, lots of numbers, apologies. I think this was a different contract, but what we did, hotels look at things in terms of total revenue from an event. They look at venue rental, so that's identified here, and they look at room rental, and that's identified here. And they want to recoup as much of that as possible, even though room rental is completely outside of our control. We can only control the venue rental piece of an agreement. So what we can do is we can play with those numbers and come back to the vendor with a number that still gives them consideration for canceling, that minimizes that hotel room rental thing, and also drops that total risk down considerably, so that an early rental cancellation would be $2,700 instead of $18,000, $3,400 instead of $21,000, and even at worst case scenario, the cancellation 3 days before, and I honestly cannot think of a use case that would have us canceling 3 days before that wasn't an impossibility clause cancellation. Even then, we were at $10,000 less than the original cancellation policy. So you can absolutely take the cancellation. This is hotels, so hotels have these fancy riders. Most places are just like, if you cancel within 60 days, you have to pay 50% of your venue fee or whatever. But hotels are fancier. You can drop it into a spreadsheet. You can play with the numbers like this, and you can go back to the hotel and say, we would prefer to propose this. We are a nonprofit. We need to manage our financial risk based on our, general income. We'd like to see this adjustment in our agreement related to cancellation costs. You may not get all of it, but you may get a lot of it, and you absolutely can and should ask for it. All right, so we talked about cancellation terms. They can often be adjusted. And when I go through and review a contract on a Kingdom event, because I'm the one who makes the recommendation whether or not to sign, I almost always try to adjust the cancellation terms to be more favorable to the SCA, almost always, so that I'm sort of backing off on the steepness of the percentage. I mean, let's be real. They want to start charging us for rooms that could have been rented if we hadn't canceled at 6 months out. That's kind of crazy. And I'll actually say that to a hotel. I'll say, at 6 months out, if there happens to be a cancellation, I really don't think we are responsible as to whether or not you can fill those rooms. Given the traditional, room use, I don't think that's our responsibility. And just leave it at that. All right, let's shift over to things that are specific to different hotel venue types. Outdoor venues. Make sure that you have a clear description of what piece of the area you are renting, what support facilities you are renting, like specifically which bathrooms, whether or not you're getting shower facilities, whether or not you're getting access to water or electric, etc. Make sure that the parking space that is being rented is specified, so you don't get sort of stuck with parking space that's on the far side of the space in the fairground that you're actually renting, or the venue you're actually renting. You want to ask whether or not, and you won't always have this, but you want to ask whether or not the contract guarantees an exclusive use of the site. If it's a farm that you're renting, if it is a group camping area and a major park that you're renting, that's quite possible you'll have exclusive use. But when you're dealing with fairgrounds or rodeo grounds or event centers, it isn't always the case that you get exclusive use of the site. So just make sure that's documented in your contract. Always check for whether or not there are alcohol restrictions, and there often are, and check whether or not there are driving on grounds restrictions. I adore the Trojan Park event site up there on the Columbia River, but it is so hard on our mobility impaired members of the populace that we cannot drive on that site. It is really a challenge. So, it's a really difficult thing, but we definitely want to be able to drive on the grounds of the sites we rent, if at all possible. Make sure you understand any noise clauses in the contract. You know, if you're in the middle of a residential area and it's a big branch or kingdom event and they want quiet time at 10 p.m., that's going to be really, really hard to guarantee. You're going to get complaints. You're going to set yourself up for an unhappy site owner. So just make sure that the noise expectations are realistic for what we are trying to do. Also make sure that, realistic from a site use perspective. The Athenaeum event that Madrona puts on, the big arts and sciences event, we've had that at city schools, big city high schools with giant big cafeterias and et cetera. And we have royal court generally at that when the crown is coming to that event. Schools won't let us have anything that even remotely resembles an edged weapon on school grounds. We cannot have any sort of guard weapon, even if we call them stage props, we can't have any sort of guard weapons, sort of state, any of that in our events that we hold on the school district site. Now, also we can't have, alcohol on a school district site. So that's something to be aware of. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't use the site, but that's a significant impact from that use restriction. And we need to be aware of it and socialize that with the Crown, as a part of determining their participation in the event. Finally, check for any city or county application processes or permitting processes that might make a site booking hard. We have a fabulous site up here out kind of in the foothills of the mountains. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous big park with huge empty fields, but they require that you put in an application to the city that they will review by their city council and determine sometime within the next 3 months whether or not they will give you that site. And as a part of that review, they will also determine whether or not they're going to require you to pay them to security staff your event. That's kind of a non-starter. That's an awful lot of uncertainty when we're trying to bid a kingdom event and trying to determine a budget we can live with. So if you run into scenarios where you're going to have application processes that have approvals that are hard to understand what the criteria are, or permitting processes that are expensive or can potentially result in additional financial outlay, just be aware of that and determine whether or not it's worth it. We decided that working with, Meadowbrook was not worthwhile. We just couldn't take the risk of potentially having to hire their security staff for a long weekend based on some application review 6 months from now. Checklist for outdoor events that I put together. Let me see if there's, I'm not going to read this out loud to you. Check for smoking restrictions on site, as well as fire restrictions. Check to see if they've published a set of camping rules for their site. Fairgrounds often do have a set of rules and policies related to people camping on site. Check to make sure that you have access to the water and electric on the site if it's an outdoor venue, if there is such thing. I've been at a fairground that wants anybody who accepted their electric to pay a per diem fee. That's super hard to track. Not that it's a deal breaker at all, but it's hard to track, and we need to figure out how to track that if that's something the venue is requiring. Make sure that the venue is okay with you renting porta potties and having those big bulky service trucks accessing the site to drop and service the porta potties. Not every farmer is going to necessarily want you to drive across the fallow field with a porta potty service truck. And validate whether or not you're going to have to set up garbage service or if that's included in the contract. Big one, animal restrictions. I strongly recommend we do not rent any sites that do not permit service animals. That's really tricky area of ADA law, way beyond my ability to understand the legal specifics. But bottom line, a site owner that says no animals, no exceptions, not even service animals, is probably not a good site for us to have an event at. We really need to ensure that we, and by the way, there are service animals that are sort of covered under the ADA. The question that we can ask is your animal trained to perform a task? We can't ask what the disability is. We can't ask what the task is even. We just can ask, is your animal trained to perform a task? If the animal performs a task, he is a service animal under the ADA. If an animal is there as a comfort animal, that's a different sort of support animal, more of a therapy dog type support animal. That's not necessarily under this must-have clause, but the animals that are trained to perform a task that are there to help our differently abled brothers and sisters, we have to have sites that permit those on site. That is not SCA policy yet, but that is really good practice because we are opening ourselves up to significant complaints if we do rent a site for the site owners saying no animals, and we have to turn people away who have service animals. Make sure that your site doesn't have fighting restrictions or archery restrictions. Generally, they won't. Outdoor sites won't. I will say, though, that anything within the city of Seattle cannot have archery. It's not legal. Just double check those things if you're renting an outdoor site and if those are components of your event. We talked already about permitting processes. Make sure that there aren't third-party staffing requirements, like, again, the whole having a security staff on site, having an EMS squad on standby, things like that can get really expensive. Almost all official site contract is going to have an insurance requirement of the SCA. The SCA already has a general liability policy on all officers and official representatives of the SCA. That is just general liability. That is, an example, I'm not going to back into your power pedestal, and if it is theoretically and I'm operating in an official capacity, then the SCA's general liability coverage should cover that. The most common request is for $1 million named insurance policy. The named insurance policy, really what it is that if I back into that power pedestal, site can make a claim on that insurance, not just the SCA. So that named insurance policy is $50 for a given event. And by the way, it can be $50 for a given practice with multiple dates throughout the year. It's still a $50 thing. But that named insurance requirement is almost universal with site contracts. You may occasionally see bigger ones. I think you ran across this a couple of years ago, didn't you, Clovis? A much bigger request for insurance.
Yeah, I can't remember who was asking for that. Oh, it was
that was the state park. That was the state park, wasn't it? We can go to 2 million. The society administrator can set that up. I think the cost is double, but I don't think we have any provisions to go beyond 2 million. I just don't know that that's a thing. So, but there are rare occasions where we can't negotiate things back down to 1 million, that we can cover a $2 million insurance requirement if we have to. And I see some chat questions. Nora, yes, but restrictions, fire restrictions, especially in camping policy, should be super clear, but quite often those are superseded by local fire marshal fire policy at the time of the event. So I'm actually more worried about what the fire marshal has to say the week before the event than I am about what the contract had to say a year before the event. We can still have that in the agreement, but it's going to be superseded by local fire requirements. Meryl, service animals being properly vaccinated. Yes, but I don't know how in the world we would document that. And if we should document that, that's a really great question. And let me bring that up with the Kingdom Seneschal, because I know that we bring animals across the border. We have to have proof of vaccination. I have to have proof of vaccination at my dog's day camp. So it's not an unreasonable request at all. But I don't necessarily know that we have any mechanism in place to connect that or to collect that. I mean, I have vet records for my dog, and a shot record specific printout that I can use for my dog. But whether or not we can do that and how we would manage that, I'm not really sure. So that's a really good question. And I think that's a really fair request. Thank you, Arnora. That I love the SHRM's policies. They're so clear. So that's the Society for Human Resources Service Animal Policy document, and it's a really good explanation. I've read it before. So did you, Arnora, from the fairgrounds, did you actually check pet vaccination stuff? Or did you just make that an honor system policy that they must have that? Okay, you did not actually check the vaccination stuff, because we don't necessarily know when somebody's checking in a gate that they have an animal with them. You know, the animal can be in their car, the animal could be in their RV. We just don't know. We just have somebody who's come up to gate to sign in. So stipulating it, I think, in site copy and site rules is definitely doable. Actually knowing that the person has an animal and checking their records is sort of an order of magnitude more difficult. But again, still a good question. I'll see what I can find. Any questions or comments on outdoor venue contracts? Fairgrounds, farms, parks, etc. Okay, let's talk about indoor venues. Specifically, I'm talking about non-overnight, non-hotel indoor venues with this. So again, make sure you understand the fee structure and that it's laid out in the contract. Make sure you understand if there's like a special fee for kitchen use, if there's a special fee for table and chair rental, if you have to use their linen service and can't bring in your own. There's almost always a cleaning surcharge, which is really silly because the SCA leaves sites cleaner than I have ever seen a cleaning service get them. But there's often a cleaning surcharge in contracts, so just make sure you understand those. Again, with the exclusive use question, alcohol restrictions are far more common with indoor venues. A lot of community centers, places like that are not comfortable having people bring alcohol on site, or they require huge deposits and much greater insurance to bring alcohol for private use on site. And also, again, with the noise or site use restriction stuff, that's also stuff to pay attention to with the indoor venue. General checklist for them. I think, you know, a lot of these are kind of different or the same from group to group, but you want to pay attention to policies related to bringing in outside food. Sadly, a lot of the places in the Seattle area have a pet caterer that they work with. And you can't bring in outside food if you want to have food at your event. You have to use their caterer. That's a non-starter for us. We cannot work with that venue. Site access hours. Make sure you understand how early before the event you can get in and how late you can stay after the event, whether you can get in the day before as part of that contract. Parking. There's a lot of places we go that we have to find additional parking for, and we want to make sure that we understand parking capacity and what overflow parking might look like. Aqua Terra did an event this year where they did not have sufficient parking capacity on site, and they had their officers running a shuttle service to and from a local parking area. That's a really logistically challenging thing. So really let's look for sites that both have and specify in their contract the adequate parking responsibility. So Kian, you mentioned all animals need to be immunized against rabies, etc., and vaccinations must be current. Animals must wear a vaccination tag. Really? The tag, is that just a general policy, or is that something that's a state regulation? ADA rules? Okay. Oh, gotcha. Thank you. When you're talking to an indoor venue, double check their decorating restrictions. Generally, most places I've worked with are fine with command hooks, but occasionally you run into people that are like, you may not put anything on the walls, period. That's a bit of a challenge sometimes for SCA events who are trying to create, potentially partially medieval ambiance. Technical and AV infrastructure. This is something that I'm fighting with right now for 12th night, by the way. The idea of, do we have Wi-Fi? Do we have cell service? Do we have access to a speaker system? Are we going to get charged for Wi-Fi? Do we have the ability to plug into an do we have any internet access at all? If we want to project something, do we have to use their AV service and pay for it, or can we use our own? So those are all good questions to ask when you're setting up a contract with an indoor venue. Definitely ask if you're planning to have any sort of a demo or fight practice, if you can have fighting on site. And honestly, even if you're gonna have a fight practice in the parking lot, ask whether or not they would permit you to have a small stage weapon fight practice in the parking lot. I think that that's an important conversation to have with the site owner if that's one of your goals. ADA access. I didn't put that down under the outdoor venues because there's only so much we can do with outdoor venues. Obviously, as the person who is renting a site, it's your obligation to walk the site and take a look at the facilities and make sure that those can be used by majority of our populace. But I've been to indoor sites. Here's an interesting added fee. I went to an indoor site, really gorgeous, gorgeous site in Chehalis for a feast, who had a flight of stairs to get to the main facility. They had an ADA elevator that was an add-on that could only hold 2 people at a time, had to be operated by one person that was an employee of the venue with a key. It was locked otherwise. That's not very ADA friendly. And I would venture to say, and I've been among them, by the way, I have crap knees. There are times that there are a significant percentage of our populace that could not attend an event if it required going up a long flight of stairs to get to it. And the whole sort of idea of the elevator being this one person at a time, locked down and operated by an employee only. That's how you have to haul up all your kitchen stuff for a feast too, is in that elevator. So that was, again, something that would have been really difficult to work with, and really was kind of a deal killer for working with that site. And we talked about the rest: insurance, cleaning requirements, etc. Any comments, questions, or cautionary tales about indoor venues? Kian, I'm laughing. Kian's comment is that even if we don't plan a practice may break out, because we are the SCA and people keep their fight gear in their trunk. Good point. Onward, hotel contracts. Like I mentioned, these are the highest area of risk for the SCA. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how to negotiate and how to look at a hotel contract. I would say that while almost every piece of a contract can potentially be negotiated, you should choose your battles. You should pick the top 3 things in a contract you'd like to see adjusted so that it is more fair to the SCA and helps us manage our risk. I will tell you that if you go back to a venue with a contract where every paragraph has a change or a red line, the venue is going to be, thanks, but I don't think we want to work with you. So choose your battles, pick your top 2 or 3 things that you would like to see adjusted, and go back to the venue and ask for those. By the way, one of the very best techniques in negotiating, and those of you probably have seen, some of you have probably seen this, is the idea that silence. So I may go to Clovis and said, hey, Clovis, I've done a really great job this last year. Industry shows that my job should be paid 10% more, so I'd like to request X amount going forward. You don't say anything more. You don't say anything more. That's awkward. It's awkward as heck. But asking for what you need, asking for a reasonable negotiation change to a contract in a meeting with a vendor, you ask what you need and then you are quiet, because the next person to speak is the person who generally is going to come out behind in the negotiation. You're waiting for them to respond. You're not explaining, you're not apologizing. All right, so we can talk about total pricing and component pricing of hotel contracts. I mentioned the insurance requirement already. The standard policy, the standard named policy is for $1 million. Performance clauses are a huge deal. We'll get to those a little bit later. And we talked already about cancellation policies. We also want to, address any specific rules or external document references. A lot of times you'll see folks who will say, here is our initial contract, but you also have this additional contract set of rules, policies that are here on our website. Here's the link to it. Those are all part of the contract you're signing. And I will tell you, by the way, while you can negotiate the stuff that's in that piece of paper you're signing, the stuff that's out on their website published to the world, you generally can't negotiate. So keep that in mind. Let's look at hotel cost. As I mentioned, hotels care about the total revenue for the contract with the hotel. Where did that go? Come back, PowerPoint. You can still see it. I can't. There we are. So you potentially have a combination of the venue rental. Every hotel I have worked with now is tacking on a sizable service charge onto their venue rental. It's a really good question. It might be a really good idea. Meryl asked if they change the rules on the website after we sign the contract. I would actually recommend that you take a screenshot or a screen print, like a PDF print of the website rules and store them in a dated file with your copy of the contract. That way, if they do change the rules, yeah, the written contract will take precedence, but the website rules, the ones that are like the general policies, like for instance, if they change the rules and no longer allow service animals on site, if you can point to, when I signed the contract, this was the web copy, this is what I signed, you have a really good chance of getting what you need. The idea of sort of memorializing the things that were in effect, it's almost like the college catalog rule, you go to college under a certain catalog, and there may be a new set of requirements for graduation in your field in 4 years, but you still get to graduate under the catalog you entered under. Same thing with contracts. Anyhow, back to this. You've got a service charge. You've always got taxes related to your contract. So you're going to have a cost for the venue. This is a pretty steep cost, by the way. You're going to have a cost for the venue that is just for the rental for the group activities. And then you're going to have room nights. The hotel will always want, and I'm trying to track this related to Kingdom events, the hotel will always want to know what the room nights, the hotel will want to know how many room nights we anticipate renting, and they'll put together a block for those room nights for us that potentially we may get some sort of discount on. And they will also add that into the total revenue they expect to earn from us as a customer. The venue rental itself plus the room nights. So if things come in a little more expensively than we might like or be able to afford, because let's be real, Kingdom event, we are limited by Kingdom law. We can charge $30 or $25 with a member discount per person for the event. For Crown events, that is hard and fast. For Kingdom events that are not Crown events, so that's ANS and Collegium, we can potentially propose an additional $5 that has to be approved by the Kingdom Financial Committee on a one-time basis. So the bottom line, all the money you've got to spend for your event is your anticipated attendance times $25 for a weekend event, or times whatever the heck it is you're charging for a day event. And that is all you can spend. And so when you're looking at something like this and you've got a giant venue cost, we generally would, not be cutting any contracts at this amount of money. We can't afford that event. This, I think, was a bid from Hotel Red Lion in Olympia for Arts and Sciences event, which generally runs 300 people. So there was no way we were going to be able to actually cover the cost. And as a Kingdom, number one, provided everybody gets their paperwork and in time, at the end of the day, the branch gets 40% of the revenue from a Kingdom event. The Kingdom gets 60% of the revenue from the Kingdom event. The Kingdom's goal is that we, at minimum, break even on any Kingdom event we offer. We don't have to make scads of money, but we have to break even. And for some of the big events like 12th night, the goal is to actually make some money for the Kingdom, because that's what they use to operate. That's what they use to pay for their web services, for their insurance, for their trailer insurance, all that stuff. So we need to break even. Any bid that doesn't break even at the Kingdom level is going to get a raised eyebrow from the Crown. And I would imagine the same would occur at the branch level as well. This proposal was too much money. I think we figured we had a $10,000 budget for this event. And so we went back and said, we propose, we're not going to pay as much for the venue. There's a little bit of sneaky pool, but we'd be okay charging more for the hotel rooms since we were already getting a pretty steep discount. Let's get a little less of a discount. So we're shifting the way the hotel is getting the money, and we're coming up with a dollar amount that is very nearly the same at the end of the day. But our venue cost is under the 10,000 because 10,000 was all we could spend for this event. By the way, this hotel gave us this and also kept our hotel nights at 115. Meryl, you're right, it's profits. It is net profits. Meryl asked, the Kingdom split is based on revenue, not profits. The event, yes, the 60-40 is profits. So after everything is paid for, everything must break even, or we make $1,000. We make $1,000 at the end of the day net profit. The Kingdom gets 600. The branch gets 400. So yes, you can negotiate hotel pricing. You can slide things around. I almost always come back and play the "we're a poor beleaguered nonprofit" tape, and I'll come back and generally ask them to drop their original rental proposal by 25%, generally speaking. And I have so many contracts that I've worked with Kingdom Events and with Branch Events, that I have a really solid sense of what things cost. Like I said, this one's pretty hefty. I think the SeaTac DoubleTree for 12th night, we're only paying $6,000 for the venue. And in some cases, the venues want our business so badly that if, they will just actually give us meeting space in return for us giving them room nights. But more and more often, they're going to want venue rental as well. But again, drop these numbers into a spreadsheet, play with them, think about the idea, think about what that conference salesperson is being held accountable for to their boss, is that bottom line number of overall revenue for the event. And you can play within that to try and get things to work from an event budget perspective. Let's talk about performance clauses. The SCA is not able to sign contracts with performance clauses. To be really clear, a performance clause is a clause in a contract that ties our performance against expected attendance for an event that happens. So an underperforming event that happens. A cancellation clause is a percentage of expected revenue for an event that doesn't happen. So performance clauses for an event that happens, a cancellation clauses for an event that doesn't happen. But a lot of hotels will drop a performance clause into their everyone will drop a performance clause into their contract. That if we say we are going to have 100 room nights per night, and we don't book the expected amount of room nights, they may actually ask us to pay a difference in the initial contract in room nights between what we expected and what they actually got. We don't do that. Another way of doing this is they will make the venue get a whole lot more expensive if they don't get the expected room nights. We don't do that either. Very specifically, the SCA's financial policy does not permit us to sign contracts with performance clauses. So we actually, a lot of hotel contracts have food and beverage performance related to catering or restaurant purchases or whatever related to a hotel event. We don't do that either. We never, that I am aware of and on tier, have included any food and beverage provisions in our hotel contracts. The hotel contracts are specifically rooms and venue space only. Individuals are responsible for their own stuff. So let's talk about how to handle that, because like I said, it's going to exist like this whole, the loss of revenue suffered by the hotel and the group's failure to use all of the rooms, et cetera. There's always going to be one. So I come back and I say, number one, we are not asking for food and beverages from you. We need that to be removed from your contract. I can tell you, you are going to have an insanely busy restaurant and bar, but we cannot put performance related to food and beverage into the contract. You can very specifically say, and you can use this phrase, as a nonprofit agency, our corporate policy is that we are not able to sign contracts with performance clauses. And again, that's a great place for the silence, period, end of discussion. What you can say as a counter proposal is, we have had a really great track record with this event. As a matter of fact, I'm going to pull attendance level and room nights for the last 3 years for this event, and I'll get you those numbers so you can see that you're really not at any great risk here related to performance. But again, we're not able to sign that performance clause. And I literally pull the contract from the hotel down to my computer, and I'm a techie, so I'm able to actually line it out, actually line out the things I want to go away on my computer. You can also print it out and literally redline the things you need to go away, on a piece of paper, and then get it back to the hotel for conversation. It's literally called a red line version of the contract. But in terms of the whole pick your battles, choose your 3 things you want to amend with the contract, this is one of them. This has to go. We literally, Kingdom will not sign an event contract that has a performance clause. We will not be able to work with that vendor. So that's important. We already talked about cancellation. You guys were excellent on that. Hotel contract checklist. Again, fairly simple. I think it's important to understand whether or not we have exclusive use of the meeting facilities, if there are going to be other people who are super freaked out by all these people in fancy clothes wandering through their sales convention. So it's good to know if we have exclusive use of the meeting space. You're never going to have exclusive use of the hotel. You may hit 90% ish, 95% ish, but most hotels have contracted rooms that they have to provide to flight attendants or whatever. So you're never going to get 100%, but you could conceivably get most of the hotel. So let's see what else. Outside food is generally a pretty hard and fast restriction on hotels. We cannot, at most hotels that we work with, bring our food into publicly rented hotel spaces. So like meeting rooms, ballrooms, etc. We can certainly bring our own food to our private party suites. But if we were to actually have some sort of a food service in a ballroom, it would have to come from the hotel. That's a public health rule, and that's way too expensive generally for us. So we simply set things up so that our hospitality rooms and our vigil rooms are private rooms or private suites, and the larger areas like courtrooms, ballrooms, meeting rooms, we just don't have food in them other than what people might bring with them personally in their bag. Decorating restrictions also apply in hotels. A lot of hotels will not let you hang anything on the wall. So we do a lot of stuff that's sort of on pipe and drape stands, etc. The technical fees, the internet fees, also very important to understand. Most hotels will give you a stage as part of your courtroom setup, and that generally doesn't cost, although occasionally you just need to double check to make sure there's not a line item for that. But the backdrop, the pretty drape, well, it's not pretty, the basic drapery backdrop often does cost, and sometimes it costs a lot. I'm sure most of you know Sir Matthias Bain. He has a really gorgeous folding wooden screen backdrop that we have used for tons of Kingdom events, that he's generally pretty willing to bring if he's coming to the event and can get some help working with it, and can manage that it's being, set up himself. But that pipe and drape is what they call that background drapery thing, and that's generally a pretty steep rental fee, $2,000 or $3,000 for somebody to set up a pipe frame and some cloth draped over it. It's good with the hotel site contract if the contract actually specifies some room block flexibility, that you have the ability at 6 months, at 3 months out to review the room block size and change it. And very specifically, some hotels will give you the ability to expand it in increments of 25 or whatever every time you hit your max. So make sure that your hotel specifies that. Some of the things to check for, these might not actually be in the contract. Check to make sure that room fridges are available. That is actually an ADA accommodation, by the way, that we provide room fridges for those who need to refrigerate medication. So that's something the hotel has to provide for that, but check to see if that's available broadly. I've seen a trend away from hotels actually having coffee services in the hotel room in favor of having a central coffee service in the hotel lobby. That's something to ask about. If the coffee service is central in the hotel lobby, we need to ask what their hours are for that coffee availability and their restaurant and bar open hours, because I'm going to tell you that at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they're going to people who are up on stage in court who are going to want some form of caffeine. And that's not always the time the coffee shop's open. Service animals, of course, ADA access. I don't actually have the power to veto things related to the events, the hotels we use for events, but I will tell you that an event with constant and frequent elevator failures stranding our populace for hours and hours and hours of time is not a hotel I particularly want to work with. You all get to make the call as to what hotels you want to work with. So that's kind of the areas specific to hotels that you want to check on, whether it's in your contract or just sort of in your conversations. I know folks that have had hotels provide box lunches that people can buy in advance. They've had, they've been able to arrange medieval style cooking. Some of the hotels, I adore the Valley River Inn in Adiantum. They do the best job of really getting behind the spirit of what we're trying to do in terms of serving medieval menu, banquet, helping us, letting us decorate all over the place. They even borrowed garb last time we had a 12th night there, so that their check-in folks could be dressed in medieval garb. So it was really lovely. Final recommendations. I think I talked a little bit about choosing your battles. Think about the idea that our goal is the long-term relationship with the vendor. We want to negotiate a contract that manages our risk and that we can afford, but that also respects the vendor's right to protect their interests related to keeping their business operating and getting, fair dollar for what they're providing. So make sure you keep that perspective in mind. The idea of good faith negotiation is really important to me. The idea that we don't want to make them negotiate multiple times because the person who's talking to them doesn't have the power to negotiate. We're going to look at a contract. Let's just have the financial committee look at the contract up front because they're the ones who are going to approve it. If you counter propose, like for instance, they're charging me $7,500 for my venue, and I'm like, I would really like to, I'm a nonprofit, I don't have much money, we really want to have this event at your hotel because it's so marvelous, but I only have 6,000 to spend on a venue. Can we do this for 6,000? If that's accepted, don't come back and go for 5,000. That's crappy behavior. That's negotiating in poor faith. Don't move the goalposts. So think about that kind of proposal because you're only going to get to shift it your direction once, generally speaking. And again, if you reach a verbal agreement, make sure you document it either in the written contract or with some correspondence. I will tell you that many of the folks in Kingdom staff are happy to help you with contract questions. Yes, Kian, get your important negotiations in on the first pass. Mostly it's the dollar thing. The good faith negotiation thing is all about the dollar thing. I'll be open about this. I helped negotiate the contract for the Collegium, the one that's kept moving forward every year at the Everett Marriott. And I got them to drop the dollar amount they were charging from like $9,500 to $6,500. They dropped a lot off. And the Crown gave me direction to go talk to the hotel and see if they'd take more off. That's really counter to what I believe about how we treat our vendors. So what I did do was I wanted to also honor the Crown's request to see things be a little cheaper. I went back to the hotel and I asked them if we gave up these 2 rooms that were not that convenient to the event anyway, if we could drop the price a little further. So in terms of coming back for that, yes, you can watch this as a recording later on. You can also just email me or PM me. I'm generally super willing to ask questions. But the idea that if I'm going to try and have a second negotiation pass because somebody said less money or whatever, I'm also going to not just ask them to remove that money just in general. I'm going to say, well, if I de-scope this a little bit, if I drop some of the rooms we've been planning on and make this easier on you, can you drop the money a little further? That's something that is sort of a valid additional conversation as opposed to, I know I agreed on 6,000, but can we go less now? That's not so cool. So change the equation on both sides and it's a fair second pass. Ask them to keep coming down, not quite such a easy to digest message. But again, ask Kingdom staff for help if you want help with reviewing a contract, especially if one seems weird or you've got some interesting things you'd like to have them take a look at. You can certainly ask us for help with negotiation. Adia, myself, there's a lot of great folks down in Summits who've done a lot of hotel and site venue contract negotiations, who can certainly help you look at a contract or even make an appointment with you to go visit a vendor or to get on the phone with the vendor and have conversations about pricing and about contract scope. Well, I mean, Cassandra, Devereaux, Seamus have done it. Lindis, Nadezhda, Mistress or Baroness Isolt down in Adiantum. Gosh, so many folks in Three Mountains and Dragon's Mist have done a lot of contract stuff. So definitely ask for help. You can reach out to me. You can reach out to Adia. We'll be glad to help you with that. And then the final reminders, I guess the final, takeaways is who is authorized to sign contracts? The Seneschal. Absolutely, like the plague, avoid performance and attrition clauses. Really take a look at those cancellation clauses and make sure they're structured in a way that if the worst case happens, we aren't bankrupted as a branch. Please negotiate. Please feel empowered to negotiate your contracts because we really don't have as much money to spend as the average corporate entity. And please do ask for help. Question, can the meal plan be affected by site contracts or not really? We actually prefer to not have any food and beverage stuff in the contract at all. We are not going to be able to commit to expenditures by the populace in general, but we can very much have separate conversations with the hotel and give them recommendations on open hours, give them recommendations on this is the kind of traffic you'll generally see, give them recommendations on a box lunch would probably go over really well because this is a long court with no breaks. So we can certainly work with the hotel to help them fine tune their offerings to us as a populace. But very specifically, we don't put any of that in a contract related to the venues signed by the Kingdom Seneschal or the Branch Seneschal. Okay, cool. That is about it for content. Email addresses for the folks at the Kingdom level who can assist. Again, like I said, when we got started, I'm wearing the events hat temporarily until we find somebody else for that role. So if both events and education, come to me. So, but in the near future, we should have somebody else understudying me and then taking the events piece back on again. So definitely reach out if you have questions. I'm Jerry Cisco on, yes, absolutely. I'll send the PowerPoint out. I'll send it to Thane Clovis and he can distribute it to everybody. Let's see, did I have my real name on this slide? I don't have my real name on this slide. My real name is Jerry Cisco. I'm on Facebook. I use Facebook a lot for SCA business. So please do feel free to PM me there, send me an email at the events email address, or reach out if you do have follow-up questions or need more information. We will get this slide deck available because there's a lot of information in it, and folks can download that and use it. Meryl, site contracts based on profit sharing with the site rather than a flat rental fee. I have never done that. I don't think we would have an objection to that. I don't necessarily know from again, the idea of an equitable contract that manages risk for both parties, if there's a lot of incentive for the site in doing a contract based on profit sharing, because they have no idea who we are. And, might potentially be dropping us potentially into performance clause area. I have also seen, not quite that, but related to that, there are events we work with that are venues we work with that want to have a per person fee. I think Nick's Ranch, where we have Autumnmore and occasionally Crown, has a very low, it's like a $2 and something per person fee. So they want our gate numbers, and that's kind of how they handle that with the per person fee. But I know it's like, if we wanted to have an event at a state park in Washington, it's a $10 fee for every single person through the gate. That would mean that's a pretty significant hit to on-tier's populace, especially if they're struggling to avoid the event to begin with. So that's something to be aware of. But the actual profit share thing, I haven't ever worked with that. It's certainly not a deal killer. We'd certainly have to look at that really carefully and make sure that we are sort of setting out those expectations clearly and yet not guaranteeing anything on the SCA's part and not setting ourselves up to a performance clause scenario. Wow, I've gone on for an hour and 15 minutes. Thank you for your patience.
It was very informative.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, there's a lot of technical information in this space, but this is, I've taught this for years in various forms, but with the advent of COVID and all the cancellations that we've had to deal with and reschedules, getting this stuff right has shifted from back burner to front and center priority. So I definitely want to get this class out as often as we can. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. This has been great conversation. It's been wonderful to see faces. It's, obviously the thing we miss about not having events. So it's been great to see faces as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much for teaching it, and you have a good evening.
Thanks. We'll talk to you later. Bye.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful class.
Yeah.
Right.
And we got you listed to teach another class in January.
Yeah, so I'm going to do the Seneschaling Basics class in January. So that's just, so you want to be a Seneschal, here's what a Seneschal does. So I will do that one as well. And, we've got a lot of classes at the Seneschal's office, whether it's me or somebody else runs. So I'll continue to cooperate with you and coordinate with you on some of the stuff that we have that's, a class has been developed and well received that you may want to repeat for Terra Pomaria's.
Sorry.
No worries.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yep. Have a good evening.
All right. Bye.